Garmin hasn't officially announced its next generation of outdoor watches yet, but the company may have accidentally left behind some very important clues. Over the past few months, regulatory databases have started filling up with new Garmin model numbers. And when you put those filings together with Garmin's previous launch patterns and software activity, a much bigger picture begins to emerge. We're potentially looking at multiple new watches rather than a single successor. The evidence points toward a new Enduro, a new Fenix generation, a successor to the Fenix E, and potentially an even more advanced Fenix model with cellular and satellite connectivity. None of these product names should be considered officially confirmed yet, but the regulatory trail is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Let's start with the most interesting filing, because it could reveal one of Garmin's most ambitious outdoor watches yet. One recently certified Garmin device is associated with model number A05419, although the filing itself doesn't actually call it a Fenix 9. Garmin describes the product in regulatory documentation using a generic classification, but the accompanying SAR documentation provides a much more interesting clue. It identifies the hardware as a wrist-worn device, which strongly suggests we're dealing with an actual smartwatch rather than a separate Garmin accessory. And then things get even more interesting when we look at connectivity. The documentation reportedly references LTE Cat-M1, including support for North American cellular bands, along with NTN satellite communication. NTN stands for Non-Terrestrial Network Connectivity, essentially opening the door to communication through satellite infrastructure rather than relying exclusively on conventional cellular towers. If this hardware ultimately becomes part of Garmin's premium Fenix lineup, it could represent a major step forward for people who spend extended periods away from traditional cellular coverage. The filing also points towards several familiar wireless technologies, including Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, ANT+, and NFC. Put all of that together, and you're looking at a remarkably comprehensive connectivity package for a Garmin wearable. But here's where we need to slow down. The regulatory documents don't actually say Fenix 9 Pro or Fenix 9 Pro with inReach. Those names come from the broader rumor picture and Garmin's existing product strategy. So while the hardware appears consistent with the idea of a premium connected Fenix, we shouldn't treat the product name as confirmed until Garmin says so. Still, there's another clue that makes the theory particularly interesting. The testing documentation reportedly references multiple watch band configurations, including nylon and vented titanium options. That reinforces the idea that this isn't simply a generic wireless accessory. The hardware appears to have been designed around an actual wrist-worn Garmin product. And if Garmin is preparing a premium Fenix with cellular and satellite connectivity, it could become one of the most capable outdoor watches in the company's lineup. But that's not the only watch we may be getting. Another device that has appeared in regulatory records is model A05216. This one is particularly interesting because it's being classified as a mobile GNSS navigator, which fits much more closely with Garmin's traditional outdoor watch hardware. The wireless specifications reportedly include Bluetooth, dual-band Wi-Fi, and ANT+, along with Garmin's expected charging and navigation capabilities. The external photographs and user documentation are reportedly under a lengthy confidentiality period, which means the regulatory database doesn't give us a clear look at the physical design yet. However, the timing provides an important clue. This device is widely believed to be connected to the next Enduro generation, potentially the Enduro 4. Why does that theory make sense? Because Garmin has established a recognizable release pattern. The Enduro 2 arrived in 2022, followed by the Enduro 3 inches 2024. That's roughly a 2-year cycle, and the Enduro 3 launched alongside Garmin's Fenix 8 generation, and the original Fenix E in August 2024. If Garmin continues that pattern, a new Enduro arriving around the same period in 2026 would make sense. And that would make the Enduro 4 one of the strongest candidates for Garmin's next major outdoor watch launch. But the Fenix family is where things become even more complicated. 2 additional model numbers, A05419 and A05420, reportedly appeared in Indonesia's DJID certification database in July 2026. Both were classified broadly as outdoor products. and were submitted through Garmin's Indonesian distribution operation. On their own, those certifications don't tell us exactly which watches they represent. But Garmin has done something similar with previous Fenix generations. The Fenix 8, for example, was offered across different display technologies, with AMOLED and MIP-based configurations forming an important part of the lineup. So it's possible these newly certified models could represent different display versions of the next standard Fenix. If that theory is correct, we could potentially see the next Fenix generation continue offering consumers a choice between a brighter, more modern AMOLED experience and battery-focused advantages of MIP and solar technology. And that's actually an important distinction, because Garmin isn't competing with traditional smartwatches in exactly the same way across its entire lineup. AMOLED models appeal to people who prioritize display quality, animations, maps, and everyday smartwatch usability. MIP and solar models are much more focused on endurance and outdoor visibility. Garmin has increasingly been trying to serve both groups, so maintaining those options would make a lot of sense. There's also an interesting rumor surrounding the smaller Fenix size. Previous reports have suggested that Garmin could potentially differentiate its display options by case size, with the smallest configuration potentially leaning toward AMOLED, while larger models may offer more flexibility, but once again, that's something we'll need to wait for official specifications to confirm. Now let's move to another model, the Fenix E2. A Garmin device identified as A05146 reportedly received certification in Indonesia in early July 2026. Like the other products, it was broadly classified as an outdoor device, rather than being explicitly named as a Fenix E2. But the timing is interesting because it appeared around the same period as the other suspected Fenix hardware. The original Fenix E was positioned differently from the flagship Fenix series. It offered many of the core features associated with Garmin's outdoor ecosystem, but came with a more simplified hardware configuration. That makes the Fenix E particularly interesting, because Garmin could use a second generation to offer a more affordable entry point into the Fenix family without every premium feature. At the moment, there's little solid evidence suggesting that Garmin will radically change the Fenix E formula. So, if a Fenix E2 is indeed coming, it may continue the same general strategy. Deliver the core outdoor experience while keeping the hardware and feature set simpler than the flagship Fenix models. Now let's put all of these pieces together. If the current regulatory evidence and Garmin's historical launch patterns are pointing in the right direction, we could potentially be looking at a fairly substantial outdoor watch refresh. The likely candidates include a new Enduro, a new Fenix generation, and a Fenix E successor. And sitting above them could potentially be a more advanced Fenix model, equipped with cellular and satellite communication. That last category is particularly interesting because Garmin already has extensive experience with satellite communication through its inReach ecosystem. Bringing deeper satellite connectivity directly into a flagship smartwatch could make the watch considerably more useful for hikers, mountaineers, trail runners, and expedition users. Imagine being able to leave your phone behind while still having access to navigation, tracking, emergency communication, and other connected features directly from your wrist. That could be a very compelling proposition. But there's an important reality check before we get too excited. Regulatory certification does not equal product confirmation. A model appearing in an FCC or regional database can tell us that Garmin is testing hardware, but it doesn't necessarily reveal the final marketing name, launch date, or retail configuration, or even whether a particular hardware version will be released globally. Companies can also certify multiple hardware configurations that never become widely available. And regulatory documents usually don't tell us everything we want to know about processors, battery capacity, software features, sensors, pricing, or final design. That's why these filings are best treated as pieces of a puzzle rather than an official announcement. The good news is that when multiple certifications start appearing around the same time, and those certifications match a company's previous release patterns, they can provide a surprisingly useful indication of what's being prepared behind the scenes. And Garmin's timing makes this particularly interesting. The company has already established a fairly recognizable pattern around its major outdoor watch launches. If Garmin follows a similar schedule again, the next major announcement could bring several products together, rather than introducing each model completely independently. That would make sense from a product strategy perspective as well. The Fenix would remain the flagship outdoor platform. The Enduro would target people who prioritize extreme battery life. The Fenix E could provide a more accessible entry point. And a connected Pro or inReach-focused model could target users who need advanced communication capabilities. In other words, Garmin may not be preparing one new watch. It could be preparing an entire new generation of outdoor hardware. For now, though, the safest conclusion is that these products remain strong possibilities rather than officially confirmed releases. The regulatory filings are real pieces of evidence, but the final names, specifications, pricing, and launch dates still need to come directly from Garmin. So if you're currently considering buying a Fenix, Enduro, or another premium Garmin outdoor watch, it may be worth waiting if you don't need one immediately. The regulatory activity suggests that Garmin has new hardware in development, and the next generation could bring meaningful changes rather than simply cosmetic updates. But if you need a watch today, the current Garmin lineup is still highly capable. There's no reason to assume existing models suddenly become bad just because newer hardware may be on the way. The bigger story is what these filings tell us about Garmin's direction. More connectivity, more outdoor-focused hardware, more choices between AMOLED and endurance-oriented displays, and potentially much deeper integration of cellular and satellite communication. If Garmin really is preparing all of these products for its next outdoor generation, the next few months could be very interesting for anyone following the Fenix and Enduro families. And, as always, until Garmin officially takes the stage, treat the leaked model numbers and predicted product names as clues, not guarantees. Garmin's official announcement will be the only source of truth. Stay tuned for more updates as they emerge.